Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the COVID-19 webinar by Tryon Medical Partners. This is the March 31st session, which will be recorded and posted on the Tryon Direct website. I'm Patrick Brady, Senior Vice President at Tryon Direct, and I'm responsible for business outreach. Today we have attendees from across the state, and some of you have participated in our past events. Welcome to everyone. It's very clear to us as business leaders that you are seeking plain talk and real-time updates on what you're faced with. Things change by the hour, and we are a medical practice on the front lines of dealing with this pandemic. You should know what we know. We are fielding many employer questions on a host of topics, and for this reason, we have formed our COVID-19 task force. It is made up of medical, business, employer, and financial expertise. And there are two ways that we seek to support you. Through this webinar, which is held on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 4:30 to 5:30, and through our task force, which can be reached at tryondirect.com. Our goal is to give you as much real-time information as we possibly can. The agenda for today, as you see on your screen, if you're in the webinar, includes a clinical perspective. Dr. Dale Owen, our CEO at Tryon Medical Partners and practicing cardiologist. Employer best practices. Stephen Gage, PhD with Gage Benefit Advisors, and Amy Cooper Hakeem, PhD with the Cooper Strategic Group. Legislative impact. Granger Pierce, labor attorney at Vanoy, Reutlinger, Adams, and Pierce. Financial market insight, Alex McAllister, CEO of Sterling Capital. We will talk a bit about the Tryon Direct COVID-19 task force and how you can engage with us in that way. And we will also have a Q&A where we will take your questions either by phone or in the Zoom chat. Just a public service announcement. If you are on the phone and you wish to ask a question, *6 to unmute. If you're on the webinar, you can chat with us online. Also on the call, we have Gaston Gage, our Chief Strategy Officer of Tryon Medical Partners. Now, you're going to see a few visuals as we go. These are really meant just to give us some context. Most of this, however, will be conversational, and we will save time at the end for questions and answers. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Dale Owen for clinical perspective.
Some updates. Let me give you some updates as to pardon me, what we know is going on now in the realm of this COVID-19 pandemic. Earlier today, we crossed 180,000 diagnosed cases. The doubling time about 10 days ago was about every 2 days. The doubling time now is somewhere in every 3 to 4 day period, we believe. Some of that is because of the social distancing and the quarantining and the stay-at-home directives by many of the governors across the United States. We are getting a better understanding of symptoms. The classic thing, obviously, has been fever and cough, but we now have about 10% of the people who are having GI-related issues, and it's fairly common to see a decrease in smell or taste as the two basically go hand in hand. We also tend to see a difference between influenza and this COVID-19 virus, and that influenza tends to occur over a very rapid onset, 3 to 6 hours with full-blown symptoms. And COVID-19 tends to be a more insidious, slow, progressive onset, can have an acute phase to it, but it tends to take days to reach maximum intensity. I want to talk to you a little bit about the testing that's available now throughout the United States and locally. Everybody's heard about the fact that we don't have enough testing available nationally and locally. That's true. Some of the laboratories developed their own tests, LabCorp being one of them. However, their turnaround time, because of the high utilization, reached as high as 8 to 10 days to turn it around because they were prioritizing hospitals rather than outpatient. Then there's a test from Diatherix, or which is called a PCR test, and it tests for genetic material. That is out of Alabama. We're actually using that one ourselves. It has a 30-hour turnaround time, but the majority of that time is transporting it to and from Alabama. A couple of hospitals have developed their own test, PCR genetic test. They can take 10 hours, but most of them are only testing for COVID-19. The Diatherix test that we use now, for the most part, tests for COVID-19 and several other bacteria, including strep, mycoplasma, which was the old Legionnaire's disease, and some other things. That test is very similar to the one that some of the hospitals are using. We really like the Diatherix test because it is able to test multiple things at the same time. And now there's a new test that's out, some of you have probably heard of, from Abbott, that is also testing for a piece of the genetic material. And it takes about 15 to 20 minutes after you obtain your swab and so forth. You're going to have testing capability at the site, or you've got to ship it somewhere where they're performing the test. We're still waiting to see what the false positive and false negative rates are, and at what point in the process of the infection is the test most likely to be positive. Is it before symptoms start, or when symptoms have already begun? We'll have more on that probably within the next day or so. There's a lot of information and talk out there about use of anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen, naproxen, things of that nature, versus use of Tylenol, which is also called acetaminophen. Initial studies were anecdotally suggesting that anti-inflammatory medicines like Tylenol and, like Advil, which is ibuprofen, naproxen, and so forth, were more costly to the patient, causing more injury. That, I think, has been debunked now, and it was even mentioned last night on national news that anti-inflammatories really have not been demonstrated to show any problem versus use of Tylenol. Frequently, we say in intensive care units in the past that everybody with a bad infection, to be able to get over it, we will use anti-inflammatory medicines called steroids. And those have, however, been demonstrated to have more injurious problems when used. So we're staying away from steroids, even inhaled steroids that people might use who have asthma. Clinically, we're seeing that the level of fever or temperature does not really correlate with the degree of the disease and the severity of it. The main symptoms still are going to be shortness of breath and an elevated pulse rate that signify that patients are worsening. Even in mild disease, most chest x-rays may show even mild patchy infiltrates in the lungs, yet may have no major symptoms. Obviously, in more severe cases, we see tremendous patchiness of the lungs, and it's related to the inflammatory response that causes a weeping of fluid into the almost sponge-like portions of the lungs and makes them fill with fluid like that. We are also frequently seeing what we call secondary infections or co-infections with other bacteria or viruses. At first, we thought that the best thing to do was look just for influenza and let them go if it was negative. Let them go if it was positive and treat them for influenza. Now we're seeing that patients with COVID-19, some of them even have influenza also. Some of them will have secondary infections with other bacterial infections. And that's where that Diastherics test that we use comes in handy, because it might identify those particular bacteria so we have something to treat to at least kill part of the problem at hand. Let's talk a little bit about blunting the curve that everybody's heard about, flattening the curve, as some people call it. I think that everyone understands that we had to do something. And if you think about this virus, human beings are the food. We are its food source. And in order to starve the virus, we have to decrease the opportunity for the virus to have other people to infect. And therefore, the social distancing, now stay-at-home orders for North Carolina and many other states, and quarantining are so important. We're trying to blunt this curve or flatten this curve from getting such a severe peak of this, because it will definitely overwhelm our emergency rooms and healthcare systems throughout the country if we don't do it. And it might do it anyway at this point, because we're fairly late in the process of asking all the states and the nation to stay at home. So we're somewhat late to start that process. That means that when we flatten the curve, that flattened peak will last a bit longer. The initial thing that President Trump said of trying to get out back into the public by Easter was a real pipe dream and had no correlation with any evidence that was available. I'm not sure why it was said. Now it's been moved to April 29th. I think that's, in all honesty, most of the models suggest it's going to take longer than that. And most are suggesting mid to late May, if not early June. So the difference here in North Carolina versus other areas is that we have fewer cases than about 25 other states. This gives us a much greater opportunity to blunt the curve better here and faster in this state compared to other states. So the areas of the country that are most likely affected and helped by quarantining and will be helped the fastest will be the Southeast and the Midwest, most likely because of less dense patient population. As a result, however, if the whole country doesn't follow suit, then it will simply spread again and we'll start all over. So it's really important to not get that second wave of infection coming through by getting too anxious and antsy to get back out into the public, because we are very likely to see that second wave if we aren't really careful and stay another 1 to 2 weeks beyond what we think we need. China is already bracing for this. So is Singapore, South Korea, and others, because they think that they're going to start seeing that as well. So that's what we have right now. And I'm really happy that the governor went ahead and sent the stay-at-home order, not because I was looking forward to staying at home, but because it was the right thing to do for everyone in the state to try and take care of this infection before it got out of hand in this state like it is in others. I will tell you, talking to hospital systems here in Mecklenburg County, they are bracing for what they believe, and I believe as well, is likely a peak in Mecklenburg County probably within the next 2 to 3 weeks. How long that peak will be sustained, we don't know, but we anticipate at least 4 weeks. The other counties that are significantly affected are Wake and Durham counties and the I-40 corridor. So those are the areas where we have the most cases. That's also where we have our densest patient population. And I'm just really excited about the opportunity to get this under control and take the bull by the horns instead of waiting for it to attack us. Let's take away its food source and let's get this infection in this country under control. Thank you.
Dale, thank you for that. Now let's turn our attention. So we have Stephen and Amy with us. Let's try and translate a little bit of that for the business continuity and business impact. Stephen and Amy, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Yeah, this is Stephen. Yeah, with the stay-at-home order recently took effect, Dr. Hakim and I thought it would be prudent to cover sort of working from home. Amy wrote a bestseller, Working with Difficult People. So, Amy, I'm hoping that you'll talk about some of the challenges that people are having working from home and how we can be most productive in that way.
Most definitely.
So please take it away.
Oh, thank you, sure. So when it comes to dealing with difficult people, sometimes we need to step back and recognize that we may be our worst enemy in this type of a situation. We need to first take hold of our own agenda and recognize that we need to set a specific schedule and stick to it with regard to anything related to work. As you transition into a work from home type of situation, it can be very overwhelming. You may feel the need to always be on, and that's not healthy, nor is it necessary. Regardless of your role within the organization, it's very important to know when you're working and when you're not. So set a specific schedule and stick to it. Even if that schedule starts at 6 a.m., you need to know that you are not on during certain sleeping hours, or that you're able to take a lunch break and spend it with loved ones who may also be working from home. So scheduling that downtime is just as important as scheduling the time when you're working. And also, it's important to specifically designate set times when you will be, say, searching the internet to learn more about COVID-19 or watching the news. So if you have your phone set for alerts, maybe push it to the side a bit and focus on work when you are working, and also not to be distracted too easily by anything else that could be causing you to break away from work. And so by doing so, you may find that you're more productive than you would be in an office setting, because you'll cut down on some of that other time where you may be, schmoozing with a colleague when you wouldn't necessarily have that opportunity in the home-based setting. So use it to your advantage, but also make sure that you set that specific schedule and stick to it. And in addition to scheduling some downtime, remember to also place some self-care time into the equation. Depending on weather and such, even getting some fresh air can be so helpful for your psyche and your overall mood and well-being. So take time to exercise, take time to think of yourself, and make sure that you take care of your mental health as well as your physical health. And so doing all of that can really help you to be your best you. And then you can deal with some of the perhaps more challenging situations, whether it be individuals you're leading or people you're interacting with who may be frustrated or dealing with some repercussions of either being impacted directly by COVID-19 or issues related to work and difficulties in transitioning into this home-based setting.
I think one of the things that would be greatly of interest to people is maybe part two, Amy, of what you just said, and that is the emotional or mental health that people are dealing with, whether it's job loss, furlough, new environment, work from home. Can you speak to that for a few minutes?
Sure, sure. So when we are dealing with that emotional aspect, we have to take a beat. We have to stop and realize that some of this is just not in our control. And depending on our personality, we may be one who loves to know that we're doing everything we possibly can, therefore we are safe, we are healthy, we are cared for, we are caring for others. And when things like this happen, much like a natural disaster or devastation, a hurricane, a tornado, things that we can't control, in this instance, we can only be as careful as we can be. We know what science proves we can follow, and we can take educated guesses based on what we're told and make as sound decisions as we can. For instance, utilizing social distancing norms makes sense. Proper hand washing, not touching our face, that makes sense. But we can't go beyond that. We can't get a job back that we no longer have. We can't place ourselves in a physical setting that is closed to the public. So we have to appreciate what we can handle and realize that that is where we have to draw our strength. So it's not helpful to be playing the what if game. It's more helpful to say, what can I do to tackle this situation right now so that I can be comfortable? It may be writing thoughts down in a journal. It may be connecting socially. I really don't like the term social distancing. It's really physical distancing. And I think that making that shift is very, very helpful. We are physically distancing ourselves from others. We are physically distancing ourselves because we are trying to either keep ourselves healthy, keep others healthy, do something that is good for the community so that we don't pass this on. But we are not socially distancing ourselves due to the advances in technology. We're able to connect, whether it be by phone or by internet. We can still interact with people. And so it's very important to maintain that social connection. And doing so can really help to not feel as alone and as isolated. And so whether that be connecting with friends, colleagues, family, checking in on people, especially those who you know may be all by themselves or elderly, can actually not only help that other individual, but really help you to overcome a feeling of desperation and isolation. That is incredibly overwhelming to individuals and actually can make them feel almost like they have ants in their pants and they need to leave and they need to escape out. And that's why we hopefully will continue to hear guidance encouraging, like we were saying at the start of the call, don't go even after, after we might be in the clear. Giving it that little bit of extra time can actually help us. But what happens is it's human nature to want to jump out the second we can because we can. And just do your best to focus and remember why you're doing this and recognize that it's not just you, it's bigger than you. And when we see the positive, then we can look and feel like we are contributing in a way that will help to move things forward in a positive light. And when we have that positive attitude, positivity truly breeds positivity. So if you have a naysayer in your group, if you have a person who isn't necessarily following the rules or wanting to, or someone who is struggling, or someone who, God forbid, is dealing with the disease or knows someone who has been affected, then relying again on fact, not searching the internet and scouring and watching videos of all these special fancy things that may work, may not work, rather rely on reputable sources like we heard at the start of the call. Also, utilizing governmental websites and other areas where we'll have direct information that is factual and fact-based. That can help to not cause us to feel any sense of unneeded desperation, recognizing that during times like this, true pandemics are scary, and we have to be practical. We can't just say, oh, the world is great, because, quite frankly, it's not. But here's what we are doing about it, and here's how we are going to make sure that we feel as comfortable and as safe as possible. There are certain things that we can do that may be unnecessary. It may make you feel better, but not necessarily help the situation. So for instance, you may not need to wash your hands every 10 minutes, maybe just before you eat, or after you are touching something where you might put your hand toward your face. But if it makes you feel more comfortable, wash your hands when you think about it. Set a timer, wash your hands more regularly, or keep track, make it a game. How often are you touching your face? You know, oh gosh, I shouldn't be doing that, even though we know that you know, we are only going to perhaps pass on the disease if we end up touching an infected object and then touching our face. That's a way that it can happen. And so there are studies that say that we touch our faces anywhere from 20 to 90 times in an hour. And so, you know, perhaps play a game with yourself and try to train yourself not to do those type of things. That can help you to feel like you are taking control back. You are able to say, here's what I am doing. And when you feel overwhelmed or you feel nervous or you feel upset, recognize that this too shall pass and be forward thinking while still being positive and proactive.
Amy, can I
Amy.
tack, excuse me, Stephen, you want to add something?
Well, I just want to ask Amy, in addition to supervisors and managers being positive, are there other tips for how supervisors and managers that are on the call, you know, how they can check in with employees and support employees, both mental health wise and productivity wise?
Yes, I think that we need to set clear expectations and be flexible. So recognizing the role that of the individual you're managing and knowing their level of comfort working remotely, whether they have the technology needed, whether they have the skill set to do so, giving them whatever extra help or guidance you can. If necessary, set up a buddy system. Maybe someone can help with one task and the other person can teach or train on the other. But flexibility is going to be key here, along with making sure that your employee is aware of any available resources, whether they be an EAP or you know, some type of mental health or counseling services that you perhaps offer. Also being aware of the regular websites. You know, here's information, here's how you can gather, you know, the latest updates on this. You know, those types of things show that you care, but also don't forget some of the things that you might have done in the office setting. If it's someone's birthday, let them know. Say, hey, happy birthday. Send out an email to the team. Don't forget the things that make us human. Again, remember that we are physically distancing, but we're not socially distancing. And so we need to, even though the world is saying social distance, it's truly just physical. We have to still maintain that connection. And when you remind your employees that you are human and that you see that they are human, they're not just cogs in a wheel, they are a part of a group of people who work interdependently to get a job done. They're a part of your team. And you care for them. If they need to talk, you should let them know that you're available.
So,
you know,
Amy,
consider even having like an office hour or a chat time, you know, 10 minutes a day, you're available to catch up.
Amy,
Can be a way to connect.
Yeah, thank you. I want to jump in just for the sake of time. Thank you. That's great. I think what I'd like to do is we'll include your tips, which are awesome, in the follow-up that we send out to everybody, post on our website, so that you
Sure.
have those. Those are ultimately what we wanted to share with you as business leaders. That is a phenomenal list. So thank you for that. And we're gonna pivot now to probably one of the hardest topics for everybody on this phone to keep up with, and it is the legislative impact of what's going on. Even through the weekend and up to today, there's probably some things that you may not have seen, and so Granger's put together, I think, some helpful information and is going to walk us through this. So Granger, you take it from here.
Thanks, Patrick. And Patrick's exactly right. I mean, it's a huge challenge to keep up with all this, not only the new legislation that's come down the pipe, but also the Department of Labor's interpretation of this statute. They're supposed to be issuing regulations. I say they, the Department of Labor is supposed to be issuing regulations which they've said they're anticipating issuing at some point next month in April. For now, though, we've got a few things to go from, and some of these have been some real curveballs. The curveballs sort of started late in the week, Thursday afternoon, when some of this information was posted, and then again Saturday evening when some additional information was posted that has surprised some folks. Definitely doesn't seem to square with the wording in the statute. But first thing I wanted to point out is what we're most important for those of you all that haven't seen it yet. The Department of Labor posted up on their, no pun intended, on their website, their new poster, which it's free. You go on there, I put the link on the web here on the slide. You can just go to that link, get a copy of this poster. The poster's got a good sort of basic synopsis of what the entitlements
Granger, we might have lost you there. All right, we'll give, bear with us. This is shelter in place at its best here. So we're gonna give Granger maybe just a minute to get his audio back. And Kendall, if you could, why don't you slowly walk through the slides? Give people a chance to see some of what we're putting out to them. And Granger, I see that you're unmuted, but for some reason we cannot hear you. Maybe your phone would be better.
Hey, what we could do, Patrick, is let Alex go do his segment, and then Granger can come back in at the end of the meeting. And
Alex, I saw that you just joined, so we're gonna cut over to you here. So Alex McAllister, CEO of Sterling Capital, and you see on our agenda, we wanted to give you some financial insight into the markets right now, which we've got one visual up in front of you. That's just for context. Alex is going to take us to a couple of key things, and Alex, you can jump right in.
Thanks, guys. Alex McAllister, Sterling Capital. Been in the asset management business a little over 30 years. We're based out of Charlotte, run a little over $71 billion in assets for primarily institutional clients. And Patrick, I don't know, that's a pretty ugly graph, man. I don't know if that's just what I want to speak to, but let's dig in. I'm going to talk a bit about the markets and sort of what we've seen occur to date, and speak a little bit about where we think we're going. You see on the chart the Dow down a little over 22. It added nearly a couple of percent to that today. NASDAQ down not quite as much, down 14, and the S&P down sort of 19 out there. And obviously, unlike 08, what we really have occurring is a healthcare crisis, but that has turned into an economic crisis, and therefore that rolled into the capital markets. Now, what I would say is that a couple things. One, this is global, big deal. There are no spots out there, sort of major economic powers that aren't being touched by this in some way. So, everybody's sort of in this together, and that means a couple of things. One, we've seen all of the central banks sort of moving in concert with very strong monetary policy, trying to, create an environment where we don't have a capital markets, crisis out there. I think some of the lessons that were learned back in 08 are really coming to bear here in this current market environment. So what we saw in 08 was the Fed seeing, and then of course in 08, there were real issues out there. There were overextended balance sheets. Rates have been falling. Spreads have been falling. There were leverage in the system, bad assets in the system. So there was a structural problem. Unlike 08 in our current environment, what we truly have is a super strong economy that now is facing a drastic downturn, which we've really never seen in sort of modern history. The economy turned down, as quickly as it currently is, with just sort of a shelter-in-place type situation. So, if you look at sort of policy, there's sort of the three legs of that. There's monetary policy, there's fiscal policy, and there's regulatory policy. In 08, the fiscal policy was pitiful, as was the regulatory policy was actually damaging. They were tightening up on banks at a time in which it was all the wrong time to be kind of doing that. It exacerbated the problem. The Fed did a pretty good job. They were really the only leg that reacted well in 08, and that really, helped make a bad situation not worse, I would say. I'd say in this environment, what we've seen is the Fed learned go big, go quick, get out in front of it, which they did. It maybe didn't feel perfectly like that early on, but they were very much, when you look behind the scenes, the Fed has run their balance sheet up to $5.25 trillion. The ECB's over 5 trillion euros out there. They have used numerous tools, many of which they developed in 08, as well as new facilities out there to calm the capital markets. It's not that they're going to fix, the stock market out there. Obviously, we're seeing real economic damage occur. Earnings are going to drop, and so securities are going to reprice based on that. But what we want is the markets to be functional in doing that repricing, and I think the Fed has done a good job of that. The fiscal policy side, whether it's 2.1 or 2.6 trillion, our best guess, if we sort of added it all up, it has about a $2.6 trillion impact on the economy, and it's solid fiscal policy, and it's what you want to come with, especially in an environment and with dealing with a pandemic, which we hope lasts for a finite period of time, and that they can sort of bridge the economy, which was doing very well, back to a point where it can recover rather quickly. And, one of the things we talk about, you cannot unbankrupt a company. That's a big deal out there. And so I think the government is very focused on that idea of you can shut an economy down pretty quickly, but restarting it's a whole different ballgame. So you need to be pretty careful. You want to hold as many people on the payroll as possible. Hopefully, pay those companies for those that are coming off of the payrolls to bridge those individuals. Again, 2/3 of our GDP is personal consumption. So it's just a major part of sort of the economy out there, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you create weakness, you lower confidence in both companies as well as individuals, and then you kind of have a spiraling economic situation. And then the last piece is really regulatory policy, which isn't a big issue here. We have seen the regulators just being responsive and basically standing out of the way while fiscal and monetary policy occurs. So where are we? Total economy runs at about $22 trillion in the U.S. And the focus points right now are China. China is very different than any other country in the world. Not real sure about the actual numbers that may have died in Wuhan, but the facts are they were able to contain it. It is trickling back a bit, but everyone is watching China, one, for a resurgence of the virus, but two, really how fast the economy comes back. We've heard, these conversations about a V-shaped recovery or a U-shaped recovery. What we all don't want is an L-shaped recovery. And so, there's a lot of focus on what's occurred, what's occurring in China and what will that look like in the coming weeks. I hate to say, you know, we who spend a lot of time in the markets and the economy are used to looking at certain things, and that's not at viruses. Now, we've just spent an enormous amount of time thinking and looking at viruses and models and thinking about, you know, a pandemic and what really happens. So a lot of what you see the market focusing on is, you know, what's occurring, what's the new cases in Italy and Spain and now New York, what's happening with deaths, how about ICU and those systems, and when are they being stressed, and how many more people are moving into the intensive care? Because what everyone is trying to figure out, which we've all been talking about, is what is the curve? How steep will the curve be? How much will it overrun any of these sort of healthcare systems out there? And we obviously have half our cases in the U.S. are in New York. What we've already figured out pretty quickly is that these hot states are going to cede the cooler states. You know, there's almost sort of no way around that. And so, you know, this virus will kind of continue to spread out there. Now, you know, what the financial markets are looking at is just earnings per share, economic activity, which will roll into the credit markets. The whole idea of who's going to pay their rent, you know, in the world of real estate, what companies are going to be able to go out there and service their debt, you know, if Macy's has closed up their doors, and how long will that last, and what type of holding power do they have? So there's a lot of factors that the market is looking at, everything from obviously what's occurred overseas in the new cases. They're looking at, are there therapies out there that can treat this, that can make the situation better? Obviously, everyone's goal is to say, hey, you know, there's not going to be a vaccine here for 12 to 18 months. We're going to kind of live with this thing. How can we make it better? How can we keep it from overrunning the medical system? Now, on the other hand, you know, we really don't want an economic shutdown, which could turn out to be worse, both, you know, medically and economically than, you know, the actual virus. So everybody's trying to kind of figure out this balancing act of, well, how long do you shelter in place? Well, you know, extreme social distancing, and what does that look like? You know, we already see GM, Tesla, Ford out, you know, manufacturing ventilators. I hope we don't need them, but, you know, again, you're seeing a lot of companies beginning to move. I think we're kind of slow to pivot on this. But what I would say on the capital markets, it's, you know, the markets are going to be pretty choppy, and they're going to bottom out when we really see the cases peak. And what does that mean? That's going to be a little hard to put your thumb on, because basically, you know, the U.S., unlike other countries, I mean, shoot, 8 of our states would rank in the top 20 countries in the world. So you're going to have to start thinking about the U.S. as, you know, more about the states. And so these states are going to react around, you know, what their caseloads are. But the things that we're thinking about, and you guys out running businesses and thinking about, you know, your own revenue streams and how long will this go on, we're all going to be thinking about exactly what these governors are thinking about, as well as the federal government. And that is, are cases going up or down? And if we see caseloads roll over, you know, the most conservative case would be to say 2 weeks sort of past the peak. Now, you know, we'll see, you know, what they end up focusing on in the end. What is availability of testing and surveillance? You know, we didn't have any containment. The only containment move we made in the U.S. was to stop flights from China. Everything else became mitigation pretty quick. And without test kits, you're really not in the, you know, containment, and you're not doing very well in the mitigation phase. You know, you would look out there and say, okay, we probably are testing 75,000 people a day now. It needs to be about 750,000. You know, just saw an announcement that Abbott come out with a new test, produce results in less than 15 minutes. We need to get there. There's been a lot said about tests, but not much has really been delivered in the way of tests. That's probably going to change an awful lot in the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and that will matter on a go-forward basis. So as we have the test, as we see the caseloads coming down, obviously these governors are going to pay attention to how their hospitals are doing. They're trying not to overrun the system. You know, are there other treatments out there that are helping, that are keeping the, you know, the caseload down on the more severe cases? You know, do we have availability? Because at some point, everybody sitting at home obviously isn't going to work for the economy, even with a, you know, $2.5 trillion fiscal policy and maybe another $3.5 trillion just in implied monetary policy being introduced into the economy. You're still only hitting about a 20%, you know, of sort of an annual GDP. So that buys you 6-8 weeks out there, maybe. I mean, it doesn't work quite like that mathematically, but you cannot just stop the economy. So, you know, personal, you know, protective equipment will matter. So mask, and it looks like the medical community will probably have what they need in a couple of weeks from now at the ramp up that we're seeing out in the private sector. So the 2 weeks sort of post that. So as we get to the end of the month, maybe there are enough masks and other protective equipment out there for the rest of us. Obviously, everybody's continuing to look at these models. What is the rate of spread? When do we see the peaks? How much does social distancing affect that? And what does that look like? I feel like I'm sort of riding into what, you know, Dale's area of expertise is, but I think the last piece these governors are going to look at is how is the economy doing? If they're seeing, and you know, we're seeing it on the surveys. I mean, you can look at truckers, restaurants. I mean, none of us, we don't, you know, that's not anything you have to spend a ton of time studying. You're seeing a collapse in certain parts of the economy out there, and that cannot go on but for a certain period of time before you've done some real significant damage. So we've already heard on a federal basis kind of end of the month. We've heard some states, some aren't even on full lockdown. Some are saying, well, you know, we're closed through, you know, the first 2 weeks of even out and into May. We've seen many of the school systems closed down really for the rest of this school year. So again, the markets are going to play off of how quickly can the economy reopen, and what will be the animal spirits? How will the consumers feel? How will the small business owners feel in that comeback? So all of those sort of factors I outlined in the coming, I'd say 2 or 3 weeks, you know, the headlines are going to be pretty rough with these caseloads peaking and the hospital systems being stretched. But these are the underpinnings of what the governors and the federal government's really going to be looking at. And all of us, I'm running a small business with 160, you know, employees as well, and thinking about, you know, all of us sitting here at home, which we can do reasonably well virtually, but it's not sustainable long term. When do we get to come back? So,
Alex, let me maybe we can stop on that note. We've got 10 minutes left. Everybody, I want to just remind of 2 things. That was great, and that's actually where I wanted to end up in the financial piece, is to have Alex's expertise on capital markets and sort of where things stand. So just a reminder, we're going to put up a poll at the end, so you get to tell us which of these pieces is most helpful or you want to hear more about. Granger, I think, is back with us. So let me,
I'm back.
Before we turn it back over to you, let me just ask, I did it a little differently today as far as questions. We've sort of fielded chat questions as we've gone along. Today, I've sort of held them a little bit because we had more content that we wanted to get out there. But let me pause. Anybody that's on the phone or anybody that's on the webinar that wants to jump in with a question, get that ready, type it to us, unmute us. Granger, give us maybe just a couple minute summary. Forgive me here because we're running short on time. Couple minutes on what you think would be most pertinent for these folks to take away, and then we'll finish up with questions.
Sure. Thanks, Patrick, and apologies for the technical issue on my end. I managed to get the first blue screen of death ever on my computer while I was in the middle of this, which is perfect timing. Very quickly, this new guidance that's come down, A couple of really important questions that are asked, but one thing I want to point out on the front end, you can go look on the USDOL's website. The stuff's listed right now in the form of questions and answers. And one important thing to note, it hasn't been widely publicized, but the DOL did release this new field assistance bulletin where they basically said, look, as long as an employer is trying to comply in good faith with these requirements, they're going to take a no enforcement stance for everything through April the 17th. So as long as you're attempting in good faith to comply, if you make a technical error, the DOL is not going to try to nail you for it. But let's flip to the next slide, because this is I think the most important answer to the most pertinent question. Everybody's been asking about the governor's stay-at-home order statewide, the Mecklenburg County stay-at-home order. How does this all work? And up until the DOL issued this guidance, I think pretty much everybody that had been looking at this had been adopting what amounted to the plain reading of the statute, which was reason number one for that 80 hours for the 80 hours of sick leave, or whatever you get if you're part-time, is if you're unable to work because you're subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order. And the common thought on this has been that the governor's stay-at-home order, that the Mecklenburg County stay-at-home order, that's a quarantine or isolation order. What the Department of Labor has done is they've thrown in this extra requirement where they've said if you're unable to work, what that means is your employer has to have work for you. And then one of these qualifying reasons comes into play that keeps you from performing that work. So the DOL has added this unable to work requirement, and that's had a really dramatic effect on a lot of businesses' plans for how they're going to handle short-term issues. Because what happens now is the DOL says, look, if your employer closes their doors before or after the effective date, so before or after tomorrow, if you as a company close, your employees are not eligible for this paid sick leave or for the expanded FMLA. So they kind of threw us a curveball on that one. And if we can skip to the next slide, that also applies if employees are furloughed. So if the company, and a lot of employers have been adopting a furlough strategy where they've said, we're gonna shut down for a short period of time. The DOL says, again, if you're furloughed, you're not going to be able to get sick leave. Same thing's true for a reduction in hours. And the reasoning behind that, the DOL says is, well, you're not prevented from working those hours due to a COVID-19 reason. You're prevented from working those hours because your employer reduced them. It's kind of a chicken or egg issue, if you ask me, because the employers reduced the work hours ostensibly because of the COVID-19 qualifying reason. So it's a little bit, seems like a little bit of a circular issue. I don't really agree with the DOL's approach on this. There are other examples that I won't get into in their guidance where I think they've really misread the plain wording of the statute. But right now it's the guidance that's out there, and my recommendation would be on something like this that you follow it. That's the safest approach, is to follow the DOL's guidance. Let's flip to the next slide quickly. There's also been a question about the small business exemption. We've talked about this before. If you're fewer than 50 employees, the statute had a provision that was in there for the Department of Labor to consider exempting those businesses from these requirements. The DOL has come out with their initial opinion on how they're going to apply that exemption, and they've basically, and this is a real surprise, they have limited it to really only issues related to leave based on an employee's child being out of school or their child care being unavailable. That's the only reason you could get the extended FMLA, but it's also reason number 5 of that list of 6 reasons for sick leave. So the bottom line on that is, if it's not reason number 5 on the list of sick leave reasons, it doesn't matter how many employees you have. If you're 500 or less, you're going to be subject to these requirements. And there is a list of 3 items that the DOL listed. These are pulled straight from their website, and I just plug those into the PowerPoint. For the exemption to apply, you're going to have what they call an authorized officer of the business determine one of those following conditions is met. I won't read those out now. You can look at those a little bit later, but in the interest of time, let's just flip to the next slide. Another important question that I've been asked a lot, and the DOL is pretty clear on at this point, is employees generally have the right to be restored to the same or equivalent position, which is very similar to the obligations under the regular FMLA. There's a couple of exemptions and exceptions to that. Number one, if there are layoffs that are going to happen regardless of whether the person's out on leave, if they would be laid off either way, they're not going to be protected. There is this key employee exception, which I'm not going to get into from a timing standpoint. But one of the big ones here is if you've got fewer than 25 employees, and again, we go back to the school or child care, you have to be out for school or child care reasons, the employer does have the right to say, we're not going to return you if everything on the list of those 4 bulleted items has been met. I won't read through those just in the interest of time. Next slide. Last thing I want to cover in terms of, this is really the other big question I've been getting that the DOL semi-answers, and that is what documentation needs to be provided. The DOL originally in one round, in their second round of information that they plugged into their questions and answers, which was late on Thursday, put a lot of information in about documents, and they kind of pulled that back a little bit on their Saturday afternoon publication. And instead, they kind of defer to the IRS. They say return, you should keep appropriate documentation for your records. Well, obviously, you want to keep appropriate documentation for your records because you're going to be the one claiming the tax credit as a business owner, so you want to have that documented. They also conveniently direct you all to consult the IRS and the IRS's forms and information. Unfortunately, those don't really exist yet. So when they're there, that's where you're going to want to look. My suggestion here, I put in here, is document, document, document. The examples that they gave you, that the DOL has given us, are things like notices that are posted on websites, things posted in newspapers. If you get an email from an employee of the school, your child's place of care, the child care provider, anything you can get like that, you want to get whatever documentation you can to establish the reason the employee was out. Very importantly, the DOL also provides that if an employee is not going to give you that information, if you can't get enough information to establish eligibility for that payroll tax credit, then you're not required to provide the leave. My suggestion would be, if a situation like that comes up and there is some kind of conflict about providing information, that's an area where you as an employer will need to tread very, very carefully, because not providing the leave is a violation, as I mentioned a couple of webinars ago, the Fair Labor Standards Act minimum wage requirements, and that can get you into hot water on that end as well. So that's in a nutshell where we are.
Yep, yeah. Granger, I need to take it back. We're right at 5:30, so I want to end with, and I have not seen any questions, so we always welcome the questions, but let me direct you to the Tryon Direct Task Force, and the website is TRYON, what you see here, direct.com. So we would welcome your questions. Kendall, I'm going to let you you show the poll if you would like at this point. Okay, all right. Not seeing any questions. I think we will let you all part. We thank you for joining us. Do engage with us on the website. We'll be back together again on Thursday at 4:30. Thanks, everyone.